Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Whether you're a pastor, church leader, or a passionate member of your faith community, this podcast is designed to challenge, inspire, and equip you with the tools you need for impactful ministry. And now for a little bit about the guest for this episode.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today, Loren Richmond Jr. welcomes Dr. Sarah Bereza to the program. Sarah holds a PhD and a certificate in feminist theory from Duke University and has focused her research on music and theology in American Christianity. She is the author of Professional Christian: Being Fully Yourself in the Spotlight of Public Ministry. Sarah is a lifelong church musician and currently serves as the director of music at Grace United Methodist Church in St. Louis, Missouri. She shares resources, including a newsletter at sarah-bereza.com. A reminder before we start today's conversation, please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and share Future Christian with a friend. Connect with Loren, Martha, and Future Christian on Instagram. Shoot us an email at loren@resonatemediapro.com with comments, questions, or ideas for future episodes. We appreciate your voice in how we faithfully discern the future of the church. And now to today's conversation.
All right, welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. I am Loren Richmond Jr., and today I am pleased to be welcoming Dr. Sarah Bereza. Thank you so much for being here.
Here.
Yeah, great. Well, let's begin with this. Anything else you want our listeners to know about you?
Oh, I write a whole bunch. I have 3 small children that occupy my time, and music for life. So much music in my life.
Okay, cool. You know, I don't know, we'll get into this here in a second. You growing up independent Baptist like me, spoiler alert for our listeners.
Good times.
I've been really getting into like CCM of late. Were you allowed to listen to CCM as a kid?
Oh, absolutely not.
Okay.
In fact, my doctoral dissertation dealt with theologies of music. In a way, it was me processing my childhood. As a musical person, all the theological reasons, the religious beliefs around why that wasn't allowed, why it wasn't just that secular music, for the most part, wasn't allowed, but that Christian contemporary music wasn't allowed. And so if you're really want some good nighttime reading that'll put you to sleep, there's like 400-something pages of that up on ProQuest. Go read my dissertation.
I'm gonna have to have detail. I'll have to have you send me that, because that sounds right up my alley.
I mean, there's a lot of good stuff there, but it's also like, academic.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up independent Baptist, and I was the shade of independent Baptist where it was sort of like ambiguous about whether it was okay or not. CCM type music. So anyway, let's get into that. Share, if you would, about your faith journey as growing up independent Baptist.
I grew up independent, fundamental, Bible believing Baptist. And for my particular family, and if anyone has like interacted with independent fundamentalists, like that's each church is its own little island in a way. So there's a lot of, how many flavors could you have? That's how many Christians there are. And so my particular variety was, if we think in terms of denominational surrogates, it was more aligned with Northland Baptist Bible College.
Okay.
Somewhat aligned with Bob Jones. For the most of my childhood, I didn't have a Bob Jones style education, but that's actually where I went for my undergraduate degree. But it was in that particular vein, and it wasn't in the King James only vein. My family was very emphatically not King James only, and was pretty emphatically racially inclusive. So that limit. So we were not in the King James only churches. We weren't in churches that wouldn't allow Black people to worship. So that was like my particular variety of fundamentalism growing up. And I, as a musical kid, for a long time thought, well, this is not where I'm going to land. And but also I grew up in a bubble. I was homeschooled. I went to a very small church. My world was extremely small. And so I didn't really know what was out there. And I also felt a lot of love for God and a lot of love for my people. And in the world that I grew up in, it was, well, you're either fundamentalist Baptist or you're a godless atheist,
right?
Presbyterian, you know, like these are the two options. And so growing up, I was like, well, clearly there have to be more options, but I didn't have an opportunity to see more options for the most part. So when I was in college, I did a little bit of exploring. I went to Bob Jones University, which was not so much now, but at the time, you know, pretty clearly fundamentalist, and its own kind of bubble, but more permissive in a way. I was allowed to wear pants at Bob Jones, unlike in my childhood.
Wow.
And so like it was in many ways had more freedom than my childhood home. And so I began exploring Eastern Orthodoxy. And then as a graduate student, I converted to Eastern Orthodoxy, which I still feel a lot of kinship for. But over the years, this is now like, I graduated from college about 15 years ago. Over the years, I have worked extensively in the mainline as a church musician. And I have been working in mainline churches and evangelical churches since I was 11. So this has been the bulk of my life, working in churches as a musician. And I now would first define myself as a progressive Christian and not by a particular denominational label. And that has largely had to do with having children. I had my first child 8 years ago and eventually realized that while I could be at home in a denomination that was more conservative than I personally was, I couldn't raise my children in a denomination that didn't ordain women, that didn't actively and affirmatively welcome trans and gay people and queer people. If I could be there, you know, advocating for change on the inside, I couldn't raise my own children there. And so my whole family has experienced the shift in the last decade, where the churches where we personally choose to worship, not just work, but to worship, are more progressively identified than by other factors. That would be the first factor for us.
Yeah, thanks for sharing.
That's where I've ended up, at least at this point in life.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I've got to say, I'm kind of scandalized as a former independent Baptist that Bob Jones was not considered that conservative. Did I hear you right?
It was considered conservative enough for my family. Like that's why I ended up there. But it was more, there was more openness to certain things than in my own particular family.
Okay.
So for instance, like going back to the pants, like, well, I had to wear pantyhose when I was at Bob Jones, which is hilarious to me to think about. But I was also allowed to wear pants, you know, to go to the store or something. I owned pairs of pants. Whereas in my childhood home, that was, not allowed.
Okay. Fair enough. Yeah. See, I guess my childhood in my, like when I was young, and I think I'm a little older than you, like my dad tried to do like the no pants thing for my sisters, but my mom was just like, no, there's too much work.
Good for your mom.
And then, I'm a graduate of, thank goodness they have now since renamed for my resume's sake, but, it was Baptist Bible College, Springfield, Missouri. And then, but certainly like around, growing up mostly here around Denver, like Bob Jones, Pensacola, those were the colleges a lot of my contemporaries would go to from church. So what would you think is, I laugh because again, like a few years ago, my alma mater made the switch to like a more relaxed dress code. And I am still scandalized seeing students' pictures of like wearing jeans and shorts and whatnot. Cause we had to wear, or at least as a man, we had to wear shirt and tie to class. Oh yeah. Women had to wear, college experience. I think they had to also wear, you know, a skirt and pantyhose or some kind of leg covering, I guess. Very interesting stuff.
Designed to be like a business code.
Right.
Which is hilarious to me, these days. But you know, it's funny though, because like those are the easy things to talk about because they are on the surface and they're kind of funny. Can you believe I had to wear pantyhose? Can you believe they tried to blah, blah, you know, whatever the things are? Can you believe? And there's so much more under the surface than that.
Yeah.
And especially for me as a as a young person, I was 17 when I started college, and I wanted so much to love God, and I wanted so much to love God's people. And like thought of myself as, a good person, someone who really, truly cared about other people. And the system that I was in took so much advantage of that because I was kind and I was trusting and in many ways very, very naive. But that system said, well, but here's what it is to be good. Here is what godliness looks like.
Yeah.
And so for me as, a really young teenager, that is something that I had to struggle with for years. Like, really, this is what godliness is. This is what it means to be a Christian in that kind of performative way, in this way, and especially for as a woman, the way those dress codes were very much emblematic of purity culture and restrictions around women's bodies. Like, there's so much under the surface, but of course, like when I'm just like, chit chatting with people who've never heard about, where I grew up, I'm like, oh yeah, I was just, it was weird. It was wild. It was crazy pants. It was bananas. And I just kind of like laugh and move on because like, who needs to unpack all of that, in the potluck or whatever. Like, I'm like, I don't need to have these conversations.
Right. Right.
But there's so much more underneath that. Like, can you believe we had to wear pantyhose? Can you believe they made us wear ties? We weren't allowed to have, whatever with our hair. Like, yeah, it's wild.
Yeah, we don't have to go. We could probably spend the whole episode just talking about recovering from fundamentalist culture. I'm just thinking, like, one of the things that drove me crazy as a young man in Bible college was how, it was something that frustrated me, but also seemed incredulous to me, was how much expectations were put upon women, and also conversely, like, young men, it was just constantly boys will be boys thing. So I can only imagine, what it might have been like to have to live in that culture with that kind of burden, seeing it just from the other side of like, man, there's a bunch of idiot boys here. Why are we just constantly getting away with being stupid?
Yep, that was I have several brothers, and one of them is 2 years younger than me, 2 years younger in school. And so we overlapped in college. And it was just mind blowing to me, how different his college experience was than mine. And we also, different personalities and all that kind of stuff. But just such a different understanding of like, the pressures that we felt, and the potential for like, getting in trouble. Like, I was the most like pristine, good little girl. And I always felt like, oh God, something bad is going to happen. Even as I was, and I had multiple roommates kicked out while I was there. But I always felt like, something is going to happen, even though I was, the model student. Yeah. In all the ways. It just was always present there that like you could have your life blow up if you just stepped in the wrong way.
Yeah, boy, let's not. Oof. Yeah, I'm feeling some things here.
Yeah.
I want to. Before we get it, we do need to talk about your book here, but
yeah, that too.
Like, I feel like I'm just processing here. In your book, you write about, and for folks who may not be familiar with like. And I think this happens. I think this is a practice in evangelical culture, but certainly in like the fundamentalist Baptist culture, this thing of every head bowed, every eye closed. And preachers, they could just roll it off the tongue. Like I struggle to even say it right there, but every head bowed, every eye closed. And it was just like
no one looking around.
You knew what to do. And I think it was like only the worst people were actually looking around. But you write in this book this really thing that just shocked and scandalized me, but should not surprise me. You said that as someone who was playing the piano, pastors would sometimes say, I see those hands, and there'd be no hands. And I'm just shocked by that.
I know. And I have a good friend who grew up in a similar world. His was a little bit more Pensacola leaning, but similar world. And I asked him the same thing, and we feel like we couldn't remember the name because we were both like literally children doing these services. We both started as middle school students. But we were like, oh yeah, that one evangelist. We couldn't remember his name, but we're like, he would do this all the time. And like, I just, so like going back into like thinking about like, oh, those silly rules, controlling people's, what are they going to wear? How is their hair going to be? But I feel like that is a similar type of move where you tell everyone, here's how you have to behave. And like, there's nothing the matter with like closing your eyes and bowing your head and praying. Like, there's nothing the matter with that. But the performance of being in sync with everyone else, we are all going to do this now. That is such a safe thing to do. It is such a being in community with people to do that kind of thing. I'm a choir director is one of my main things that I do. And I work so hard to make a safe space for my choir so that they can feel safe to then breathe together, to do these actions together, because that grows out of community. And the work of that type of altar call is in many ways like taking advantage of that human desire for connection to all be together to do the thing. And you don't want to be that one person who's like sticking out for most people. I mean, some people do, but most people, they want to follow the social norms. They want to be part of this, but then they are potentially like in a very manipulative kind of place. They're in a place where to be acting out, to do something different is perceived as really rude, even though they're being manipulated in that particular spiritual space. It's such a shameful thing in my opinion to take advantage of people that way. But it can be really common. And it gets actually the things I wrote about in my book about the power that we have as professional Christians, and to the power to influence and the power for people to listen to us when we talk, because we have the microphone. And I'm not a clergy person, but in many cases we have like the marker of you should listen to this person. And that is a huge power that we have. And we can't just be using that willy-nilly, or to our own benefit, or to spiritually manipulate people, just because we can, just because that is a possibility that we have with our power.
Yeah, it's a great transition to talk about the book. I do want to mention, I'm not sure if you've seen this, there's the author J. Michael Jordan. I have an interview with him, probably will release a couple before yours here. He talks a lot about, in evangelical spaces, the problems with using anxiety basically to stimulate what he calls spiritual growth.
I need to look into that.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
Recommended.
That's
but anyway,
J. Michael Jordan?
Yeah. Let's dive into the topic of your book. And Sarah is the author of Professional Christian, Being Fully Yourself in the Spotlight of Public Ministry. But I want to start with this question, because you ask it yourself in the book, and I think it's perfect. What is it about being a professional Christian that makes it so hard to be ourselves?
That is a great question. I want to back up a little bit and just talk about how I understand the word professional Christian. Yeah. Because some people say like, oh, well, we're not professionals, we're called to this.
Right.
I understand that kind of like in a really simple way, which is someone whose job relies on their being a Christian. Yeah. And that you can't do that job unless you are a Christian. Or unless your church identifies you as a Christian. Sometimes it gets kind of blurry with some church staff in some churches. But this idea of like, well, to do this job well, to do this, you are being paid in part because you are a Christian.
Yep.
And when you are in those types of jobs, which include clergy jobs, but also include lots of church staff jobs, it includes lots of nonprofit jobs, working for Christian schools, working for Christian universities. Like it's not just a pastor. It's a much bigger constellation. There are lots of structural things that make it difficult for individuals to feel like they can be fully themselves. And they may feel like they have to be smaller or be a particular way. And I kind of grouped them into 4 categories, which one is that as a professional Christian, we are often held up as representatives of God or representatives of Christianity. Like, here's how Christians should be. We must be Christian. This is how God should be. People who are godly should be behaving. Here's how their life should be. Power. We often have relational power in those roles, which can be influence, but can be a lot of other things around that type of power. We are often held to high moral standards or are considered role models for people in our community. Like, oh, don't you want to grow up to be like Pastor so-and-so or Mrs. so-and-so, the English teacher? Like, well, she's a godly lady and she should, these types of things that like hold us to high moral standards, which can be a really great thing, but can also be, make people be a little bit fake in the way that they are. And then especially for clergy people, but, for some other types of people, our religious roles may also be part of our identity. So I think of that especially for clergy, because someone who is in the role of a priest is also in the identity of a priest. That's not the case for all denominations, for all clergy. Like, there's lots of ways to be a Christian, right? But that type of thing of like who you are as a person and being paid to be who you are, can make it difficult. Like, well, what if not everything fits neatly into that box? What if you run into a circumstance in life? What if you go through that dark night? How does that relate to who you are as a Christian? And that private thing in your heart, how does that relate to how you are on the outside?
Yeah, these are so challenging because I think in many ways we would say, yes, you are a representative of God, and that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Yes, you should have a high moral standard. Yes, your role as a clergy should be part of your identity.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and power certainly too, but also like these things can go off the rails so easily.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking, like, I have a good friend who was working in an evangelical space and said to his pastor, like, hey, I don't know if I believe this anymore. And then like he was gone, like, a month later.
Yep.
He was shown the door.
Yep. And that's actually, that particular type of circumstance is something I write about, because it's like, it's one thing if you're single, but what if you've got your 3 kids and your spouse and your health insurance, and like, and how do you navigate that? And in a way that is like upright and full of integrity, knowing that people do change. And I'm not even thinking just about like people who like, quote unquote, lose their faith, but, people whose perspective shifts slightly.
Right.
And suddenly like they're at odds with the particular granular details of their statement of faith that they had to sign on to be part of this particular church or whatever. And where is that line in which I can work here, I cannot work here? And when do you have to tell people? When do you have to not, like, that's tricky. That's really, really tricky.
Yeah. 'Cause you're right about being a professional Christian means that our livelihoods are contingent on personal faith.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about this even more broadly. Like, guys, I've been in the job hunt for a while, partly because I made a decision to not step away from, professional ministry in a clergy context, just partly because I needed to get paid more.
Yeah.
But being as I have a affinity for faith and missional work, like I've tried to find jobs in nonprofits that have a faith component. But like, again, to your point, like I've seen a lot of Catholic churches or organizations hiring, and they're like, we only will hire Catholics.
Yeah.
Like nonprofits who have a Christian base, like I'm not like,
but you're not the right kind of Christian.
Right. The not kind of Christian. And it's so flippin' frustrating. And I think even if I can be frank for a moment, like I tend to be in mainline context the most. Like, like I think this happens in mainline context where it's just like, you're not progressive or whatever adjective you want to use. You're not enough of this for us. So it's like, and I guess I'm coming at it from the frustration of the job perspective, which again is part of this conversation of like, it is so hard to find a job, and then when it's like, it's not only like, can you do the job? It's like, do you check the right boxes? Do you check the right theological things? And it feels impossible in many ways.
It's I feel like it's an issue that isn't, to me, not quite as clear for people who are clergy working in their particular denomination, potentially with a bishop or that kind of setup, because their pathway is in so many ways clear. And they might, have a mismatch of their politics with their congregation's general politics. Like there can be things like that. But for the vast majority of other professional Christians who are, the majority of people who I would consider professional Christians are not clergy, it gets even more tricky because so many of us didn't train to work in a particular denominational space.
Right.
Like in my case, I went and got a bachelor's degree in organ performance.
Yeah.
Like that is not a specifically religious degree. I mean, I was religious because I went to a religious school, but like, and people who do, work in social work, people who work in children's education, who then are children's ministers in churches and those kinds of things, which is wonderful. It's really tricky because like, the example I use in my book is around Presbyterians, because as we know, Presbyterians, whereas I would consider Catholicism is this big tent that has churches that welcome trans people and churches that are extremely conservative and you need to wear your lace head covering. Like it's huge, right? Whereas Presbyterian is very fractious and there's like lots and lots and lots of flavors of Presbyterianism, right? And so if you're this, person who wants to teach French and you're going to be hired by the Presbyterian school, okay, this is a thing. They're Presbyterian schools affiliated with the churches. Well, what variety of Presbyterian are they? And are you allowed to XYZ, whatever? Yeah. And like to have to navigate through that and even understand, that this is a thing that you should be asking. It's not readily apparent that you should ask or not ask. And things are also like not as clear in terms of like personal behavior. And I'm not talking about like at school, but like, who are you allowed to marry? Who are you allowed to hang out with? Are you allowed to drink? Are you like things that for most people would not even register, but like it's an actual thing for people who are in that broader, because different people have, kind of think of it as like an unspoken expectation. Well, of course people should blah, blah, blah. But that of course is different in different denominations and different, individual institutions. Yeah.
Let's shift this a little bit because I want to talk about power in ministry context. I think obviously the context that in fairness gets like the most shame of late, and I think for good reason, like I said, is in evangelical settings often power is again, it seems like abused. That being said, I think what I've seen in mainline context or progressive context is I feel like sometimes there's this real hesitancy to use any kind of power, which I don't think is also helpful. And I'm just kind of curious. That gets so complicated. So how do you talk about it?
And I have to say, I do agree. I sometimes feel like people who are in positions of power have to own that position of power and realize that they are in power and not, I feel like to pretend otherwise is to do a disservice to the volunteers working with them.
Yes.
To the, or maybe they are themselves a volunteer, but it does a disservice to not own the power that is like implicit in a position.
Yeah. Like I felt that, if I can jump in, like personally, even as a clergy person working with folks above me, where it's like, we're on this, when they come at me like, hey, we're on the same, it's like, no, we're not on the same level. Like you can clearly have significant influence over my career.
Yeah. And I do understand like that impulse. But at the end of the day, like some people can fire other people.
Right.
That's just how it goes. And that is power. And some people are privy to things that other people are not privy to. And like when I think about like power for professional Christians, some of that is literally just you end up knowing a lot of personal information about people. Like every week in the worship design committee that I am co-leading, where I work, we pray for like 6 different families or 6 different individuals, every week, roughly speaking. And we're not sitting there gossiping, but like, I don't know the hundreds of people in the church directory. And so we'll be like, oh, that's so-and-so and that's so-and-so. And so like, I know who like, I know like some difficult stories for people. And these are not like like this is not like a gossip thing, but it's like, oh, I know that their kid died a few years ago.
Right.
I know that like, oh, they haven't been to church in a while because they got upset about whatever the thing was, and they'll come back, that kind of thing. So again, it's not like, intimate details necessarily, but then there's also places where it's just like, you end up with like all kinds of stories that are kind of told to you in confidence.
Right.
I don't do pastoral counseling, but then there's that whole thing of like, you're pastorally counseling people and what can you share? And so back to the whole, like, why is this tricky for professional Christians? Because we're not therapists.
Yeah.
And therapists have a very clear mandated division between their life and their client's life, their patient's life. That is we have HIPAA laws for medical professionals. That's very clear what you can share and what you can't share. And church people, I mean, we raise our kids together. Like, I went to the apple picking with, the lady in my choir and her little kid, and that's totally fine and that's totally okay. And I'm also not, doing pastoral counseling, but like the social separation isn't there in the way that it is for people in some other professions. We also have lots of influence, and there's lots of ways to think about it. But I just think of it a lot of times as people pay attention to what we say, not always. And I'm sure some pastors would be like, "Oh my God, have you seen people during the sermon? They're not paying attention." But generally speaking, people will listen to what we say. Pastors, maybe pastors especially, perspective on the news station. Just like having that clergy collar on, where it's just like, oh, here's someone that I should sit up and pay attention to. In my little world as the music director, where it's just like, I'm in charge of the room, and I wish that they listen more than they do. Sometimes they chat a little bit much. We have a good time. But generally speaking, like I basically have the floor, and people will listen to what I say, and that is a power that we have to own and we have to be responsible for. And sometimes that comes with obligation. When I was doing this book, I interviewed quite a few people in ministry, and especially ministry in areas that I don't work in. Like I interviewed people who do chaplaincy. I interviewed teachers and pastors and people who don't work in the same area that I do. And many people spoke about what they felt like was an obligation to comment on certain public issues, to I mean, I think rightly so, say like, here's a Christian perspective, or the perspective of the historic church is this. Can we have a conversation about it? But then they also talked about like the flip side of that obligation was this sense of feeling like they shouldn't say too much because people could treat their opinion as something that they should do. And just because Pastor so-and-so has the opinion, just because, Matrushka so-and-so thinks this, doesn't mean that the person should do it. I remember visiting a church once, because the priest there was asking me about why I wasn't homeschooling my children. And I went, "Oh, that is not how power is supposed to flow. That you just met me. This is not an appropriate use of power." Clearly in that person's opinion, it was. But that is something that I think, especially in the age of social media and easy communication and an expectation that, pastors and churches and other people have like, opinions to share. But it might be has to be exactly the right kind. Other people will be angry at you. But like this expectation that they'll speak up, it gets really, really tricky, about what they should speak up, what they shouldn't speak up, and, all the different boundaries there. And like, it's really ethically complicated. Like it's not always a clear should or shouldn't.
Yeah. I worked for a church that was not a huge church, but had, several staff. So I'm thinking about like prayer requests being shared in staff meeting amongst folks who are like me, had seminary training and years of experience, and also somebody who's like the church janitor, And then I'm thinking like it had a preschool attached. So there were some in the staff guidebook, there was some social media guidelines because, A, of course, they didn't want you trashing the church or the preschool on social media, but also, like you said, certainly in this day and age, if a staff member, and even if they're, a janitor, makes like a strong political statement, that can be complicated at best, right?
Yeah. And this, I think, something that we haven't talked about yet, but that's really a big part of this is the perception of the people that we work with, the people who are not professional Christians, but who are deeply embedded in the work that we do, and their expectation about what we on the professional side of things are allowed to do is very, very difficult. And sometimes, as far as I can see, especially in the mainline, their expectation can be much smaller than what is actually true. Like, well, you're a religious professional, therefore you should XYZ, or you're not supposed to XYZ, whatever the things are. And, the social standards of Mrs. So-and-so who's 95 are pretty different from your, Gen Z up and coming clergy person. And that's not a bad thing. It's just like, you know, what Mrs. So-and-so who's 95 thinks is just polite speech is different from what a 25-year-old thinks is polite speech. Like these are just, I mean, I don't even think those are Christian things so much as just cultural things.
Right.
But can be very tricky, especially if people think about that in terms of identity, because what you can do is not necessarily what you should do.
Yeah.
Like I always joke with my choir because I work with very, very progressive and very polite Methodists. And I always joke with them how we bring our good manners to choir. And that means I don't bring my potty mouth to choir because like I'm working with people from like teenagers up into 89, I think is my oldest person. That's a huge social range of what is appropriate behavior. And so while some people, you know, I personally feel like I have to be respectful of that spectrum. And so in a way I make myself, you know, quote unquote smaller, but I don't think of it as smaller so much as like I'm behaving in a professional way that's appropriate to this context. And sometimes people feel like, oh, that isn't appropriate to this context. That's me being a fake version of myself. That is me being a dishonest version of myself. And I mean, something that gets into like individual, like, well, what is really important? Like, what is truly your identity and what is just your presentation in this particular moment? Is that against your identity? Is that just,
let's go deeper into that, because I did want to ask about that. And I think that's important because I feel like it's a challenge, especially for, you know, the circles I tend to run most in, younger clergy who similarly, like you've kind of hinted at, can often have a mismatch between like their own religious and political views and the churches they're serving in. And there's this, you write in the book about authenticity versus sincerity, about transparency versus contextually appropriate. So like, I think the example of, you made the idea of cussing, for instance, like, and I think it's made more challenging by what I'll say, as I've read from other authors, is there's this kind of cultural norm of like, if you can't wear it all on your sleeve, you're being not true to yourself and authentic, you're being oppressed, what have you. So it creates a real hard dynamic. So talk through that in greater detail.
Yeah, authenticity is something that was actually the genesis of this book. So I'd been like looking at authenticity from a lot of angles, a lot of different contexts, especially in fundamentalism. But one thing that I kept coming back to was, among the many ways of understanding authenticity, one is that authenticity as a good value is being natural or spontaneous, and that this is like the truest version of self. And this comes from like Jacques Rousseau in the French Enlightenment, and like there's a whole thing there. But like boiling it down to essence, this idea that we often use in America when we talk about authenticity is that to be true to yourself is the highest good, and what being quote unquote true to yourself is simply being in your gut emotion, in your spontaneity, in your I felt it, I did it. It's all on my sleeve. You can see it all. And that is the truest way of being and the highest good. And if you are in a professional setting, oh my goodness, that's not going to get you very far.
Yeah.
So, but what that does, that understanding of like, well, this kind of authenticity is the best way of being. This is the truest self. This is in many ways, to be clear, I'm not agreeing with this, but some people may say, oh, well, this is the most Christian way of being because it's the most true. I don't agree. But that sets up a sense of, if I behave in what many people would consider a professional way, then I am being fake, I'm being false, I'm being untrue to myself. And then because we're adding in that layer of Christianity, I'm in some way being not true to God because I'm behaving in this way that is limiting in some way or not spontaneous. And what I wanted to argue for, and what I did argue for in my book, is that there are other ways of understanding personal integrity and authenticity, sincerity, other ways of understanding self-presentation in a given real-time moment that I personally feel are much more helpful in that professional setting. And one of those particularly helpful ways for me is this understanding of sincerity, which is kind of like a cousin of authenticity, which for me is like, being who you say you are. And that allows us a conceptual framework for not being spontaneous, but also being true to who we are. So for instance, my husband is a physician and sometimes deals with like really, lots of blood everywhere. And like a gut response to that is like, this is horrible, right?
Yeah.
Like some emotional, that is the gut response, right?
Right.
But that's not the professional response. You need to run the code. You need to so you are not being quote unquote spontaneous. You're going to the plan. This is how we run a code. This is what we're doing. That's not spontaneous. That is planned in advance. That is practiced in advance. And that is what the person needs. And in a professional setting, like we may encounter, people will sometimes tell you really horrible things.
Right.
And, especially if you're doing like pastoral counseling or chaplaincy, there are really terrible things. And people do not want your gut response. That is not what people need in that moment.
Right.
They need a professional response. The professional response is the loving response, is the godly response, is the Christian response. But it is not spontaneous and it is not, quote unquote, natural. We've practiced it. We planned for it. I think this comes up especially for people like me who work in music. We practice and practice and practice and practice. And sometimes people then accuse us of performing on Sunday because we are in that mindset of like, I want to make sure it all goes together, right? And I think of that as, no, I deeply care about what I'm doing. And I am living out that care and that love for the people around me in that way that I present in the church service. And that doesn't, just because I'm not like in my emotions with my emotions on my sleeve, does not mean I'm fake. And this comes up especially a lot for preachers and vocalists on Sunday morning because in a church service, because especially vocalists in like more evangelical or contemporary settings, they're asked to emote with their faces. And if you're not emoting in the particular way, you're not quote unquote leading worship in the right way, that particular style of worship.
Yes.
It's not what I do. I'm an organist. I'm kind of hidden a little bit. I got my serious face on. But that is, many Christians are asked to do that in church services. Pastors are asked to do that when they preach. Preachers, just whoever's preaching, to have that emotive, facial, that affective, the conversations after the church service where you are like emotionally engaged with people, and that needs to show up on your face. In our American cultural context, this face needs to be engaged and it needs to have smiles on it, right? Well, what happens if you're going through something really difficult and you don't feel like it? Your emotions are not in line with what worship looks like in your particular setting on Sunday morning, right? That to me is where preparation comes in, and it's where sincerity comes in, where it's just like we're being who we are, and who we are can be, we can be sad and we can be leading in the way that people need us at the same time. It doesn't have to be a fake thing. It's only like fake if like we're lying or we are thinking that we're lying because we're not being spontaneous. There's a lot of layers. Sorry, there's a long chapter.
It's a good chapter though.
That's kind of like the nutshell of like what I'm arguing, in terms of how we can understand being true and full of integrity in those spaces.
Yeah, I think it's such an important point because I appreciate your example of like the stereotypical evangelical worship leader, like you said, has got to be kind of big and emotive and like their faith kind of overflowing, and they could be going through a personal season where they're just in the valley of the shadow of death, right? And the cultural expectation is like, you cannot show that on stage. And I think conversely, from the context I find myself in, like in a mainline preaching context, it's almost like if the pastor is too performative in their preaching, it's like, hold on, what's going on here? This is not a show. But there's got to be some kind of nuance or space, right, for both. Yeah. And so I think this leads into something else I want to talk about. Because I'm thinking of, I don't know if you ever watched The Good Place, of when Ellen becomes disintegrated, right? I can't remember if that's season 3 or 4. Let me see if I can find this here in your book. So page 93, you write about being disintegrated. You write, if we want to be integrated, we can't set ourselves up for disintegration. So let's just think about this to stay in that example of like, whether it's an evangelical worship leader going through a really rough time, either personally, in their family, with their faith, whatever, being very emotive and expressive in their leading up on stage, whether it's a pastor from a more, traditional tied down context who doesn't want faith to be just about performance, but also wants to perform their sermon or their message well. these things can feel very disintegrating. How do we stay integrated?
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like there are a lot of answers there. One that many people that I interviewed spoke about was the importance of having a close circle of friends and counselors, and understanding that like what is said in those spaces doesn't have to be like untrue to the more public aspects of what we do.
Yeah.
But that provides a place for us to be anchored and moored and have people really know who we are, like in a more broad sense than most congregants or volunteers that we work with, than those people would get to know us. And how important that is, so that we are having people around us who know us well, who are in some ways being a mirror to us and showing us who we are, is this who we are. But I would also say like one huge part of this is just making sure that we are in a workplace that aligns with core aspects of who we are, like as a baseline. And that's really tricky because like we all need to like pay our rent and eat and those kinds of things, right? But having that kind of foundational, like my values are basically aligned with the values that I'm called to have as a professional Christian in this space. Like those things are in alignment. Everything else can kind of flow from that. And then of course then there's also like the whole idea of like, well, we go through difficult circumstances and we can't always share those difficult circumstances, in more public ways, or not everyone needs to know all of those things. And I think some of this is also like, we have to realize that sometimes people can have misperceptions.
Yes.
And that's not always our problem.
Yes.
Sometimes people really think that they know us really well because they see what we post on social media, or they see us every week at Bible study, and therefore they know us really well. And like, they know part of us really well, but they're also not our best friend. They're also not our spouse. They're like, and I feel like these days, especially because social media and like being on Zoom and stuff, like, you know, here I'm sitting here at my dining room table. You can see what my house looks like. Like in the past, that wouldn't have been publicly available to people. But like these days, you know, especially during the pandemic, like I led my choir through the pandemic, my handbell people through the pandemic, and, you know, they saw like my whole house.
Right.
You know, they saw my children all the time in a way that like, it makes it feel like very intimate. And in some ways like it is, but it's also not the whole story. And, like we can't always help that people don't understand that difference. Like people can be really naive about that. And especially like if they don't quite understand like that kind of parasocial, it's not always parasocial, but like that sense that like there's more to it. And not everyone really wants to understand that or is able to understand that.
Yeah, and I think boundaries here is an important conversation, right? Like at some point, it's on us, the professional Christians, so to speak, to have our own boundaries. We can't expect people to know what boundaries, you know,
I mean, they haven't thought about it. Like, why would they be thinking about it?
Right. And I think what often so happens, this is my perspective at least, I think generally speaking, most people ask or seek further engagement or whatever. They mean well, and they're not trying to impose, but they're going to keep asking until we say no, or that's, you know, no, I'm sorry, I can't have you over to my house. No, I'm sorry, I can't stay late. You know, no, I'm sorry, I don't want to, you know, whatever, have a meal with you every other Tuesday. I'm thinking, I think it was I have an episode in the past with Todd Ferguson and Josh Packard. And then there's another book they have, I can't remember the book, but a very similar thing about the importance of clergy. And they talk from a clergy perspective, but I think this tracks, you know, having these boundaries or circles of, can't remember the exact words, you know, of kind of
relationships.
Right. Of, you know, in one context, like you're going to behave one way on stage in the green room, for instance, a very evangelical term, I know, but in the green room, you can kind of let your hair down, but also like to just be really cut and dry. Like you can't like, you know, you can't take your shoes off. Right. At home, maybe you can take your shoes off. You're not being untrue to yourself. And I also think like correct me if I'm wrong here if you disagree, but I feel like we have this really strong cultural thing towards like transparency where it's like, you've got like, if you're not showing everything to everybody, it's like you're not being you. And I'm just one like, hey, like, I don't need to see that on social media. Like, you don't need to show me that. Right?
I think that goes back to this like idea of like authenticity as nationalism,
Right.
which like has a long cultural history. Like,
Yeah.
it's 2024, but yeah, I feel like a lot of social media and things around social media allow for more transparency, which, you know, if that's what people want to know, that's fine. But it because it's allowed for, because there's a place for it, it's more, people may have more expectation from it.
Yeah.
I actually post a lot less on social media these days, in part because like I have a baby, I'm real busy.
Yeah.
But also because I'm just like, I don't want to have to go through that, like, what should I post? When should I post? Oh, if I don't post for a week, are people going to be worried about me? Like, I just, oh no. Yeah, I'm really tired. I have lots of kids. I don't have the energy for that right now. And you know, if people have a problem with that, it's kind of on them. So.
Right. And I think that's so much of it, right? It's just kind of being okay with some people not being okay.
Yeah. And that doesn't, you know, back to like the whole idea of integrity. Like, we should still be acting with integrity in all of these places. Like, people can be meeting you in one place and being radically surprised because of your behavior in a different place. Like, I think most people understand, if I meet you in a marathon, you are going to then look different at your job on Tuesday morning. Like, people get that kind of difference. But if you are acting radically different in one place and in another place, like in ways that are at odds with each other, like that is a problem. And is not, it's not a righteous way to live. Like, that's just not, you should not be acting like that.
Yeah.
And sometimes we all do this. We sometimes act in ways that are not in line with our values, that are not in line with how we would hope that we are, and that we're people, and people do that.
Well, the book is Professional Christian, Being Fully Yourself in the Spotlight of Public Ministry. I feel like we could continue to have this conversation for a while. There's a lot of good content. I want to recommend the book. Sarah, let's take a break and we'll come back with some closing questions. Do you need a minute? Otherwise, I'll just reintroduce you.
Good.
Okay. Bereza, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, we're back with Dr. Sarah Bereza. Thank you so much for the conversation and for your time. Let's go into these closing questions. You're welcome to take these as seriously or not as you'd like to. But if you're Pope for a day, what might that day look like for you?
Oh, it would involve universal health care.
Pretty simple.
Yep.
Okay. See, I always try to take notes, and you got me so quick that I did not have time to write this down. Okay. A theologian or historical figure you want to meet or bring back to life?
Oh, man. That one is really tricky. I mean, I feel like there's a lot of musicians that I would love to meet, or at least hear their music live in the original settings. I love the composer Claudio Monteverdi, who lived in the 1500s, 1600s, and man, if I could hear his music live in the day, make me real happy.
Oh, you've got to listen to. It was my conversation last week. So for listeners, you better listen to it here. David Taylor, he answered this question by, I think if I'm remembering correctly, naming off like 6 hymn writers, like historically.
Ooh, yeah.
And wanting to get them in a room. Like one was like Family Crosby, one was like, I think, Hildegard.
Yeah.
So that would be entertaining.
That'd be great.
Okay, I'm sorry. I got distracted. Who did you say? You said hymn writer?
Oh, Claudio Monteverdi.
Claudia.
I love his music. I wouldn't be able to talk to him. I don't speak Italian. But.
Okay. What's my question here? What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
Oh, I hope it remembers a turn towards democracy and reliance on the power of the people. I certainly hope that is the turn that we take. I don't know that will be, but I pray and hope that is where we are at this point.
Yeah. I'm thinking, when is this episode going to be released? We'll see.
Yeah. We should say we're recording in October. I don't know where things are going. And I don't, who knows.
What do you hope for the future of Christianity?
Oh, more unity. I would hope for the mainline that especially for the mainline, that the coming decades of mergers and potentially denominational mergers, I hope that is full of Christian love and charity and desire for the good of people, and not tribalism, not holding tight onto our own personal little treasures, but sharing freely and widely.
Okay, so you said there, I have to ask real quick. I have a friend who has suggested that really all the mainline denominations need to just merge into one mega denomination. Mm-hmm. Like, real quick, any thoughts? You mentioned that?
Would be very surprised if in 100 years that's not where things are. Like, I don't see this regionalism, which comes out of, the Protestant Reformation, and also comes out of immigration in the United States.
Right.
That we would have so many different flavors of kind of really close to the same thing. And I say this is like kind of on the outside of the mainline. I don't have a strong
dog in the fight.
No, I don't. I love John Wesley, I love Martin Luther, but it's not like one of those is my homeboy or something. Like, I don't get those cultural kinds of affinities in the same way. But I really see there's so much more similarity. And if the mainline could become more of a big tent, Catholic churches, I would certainly pray and hope that that's what happens. We do not need the divisions in the way that we currently have.
Who's maybe you don't know this, but you mentioned Presbyterians. The Presbyterians, who's their, I guess is that Luther? Is their guy? I'm ordained disciples of Christ.
Calvin.
So Barton Stone and Alexander Campbell are our kind of folks.
Yeah, the
Calvin.
Presbyterians have Calvin.
Calvin.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then I guess American Baptist, would they go John
Roger Williams?
Roger Williams, thank you. Yeah.
Yes.
We're just kind of
That's
playing
was mentioned in my childhood.
Historical games here.
John Huss, maybe?
Sure. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Who's the other, who am I forgetting? So we got the Methodists, we got the Presbyterians, UCC.
The Episcopalians.
I
don't know, we're going to have Henry VIII.
Henry VIII, right?
Hold him in the same regard. No, who wrote the Book of Common Prayer? Is that Thomas Cranmer?
Oh,
Cranmer.
I have
there you go. That's pretty formative.
Right here in front of me.
Yeah.
I don't know it. I don't use it enough to know it. Okay, and I have no idea. The Congregationalists, gosh. The UCC really goes back to the Congregationalists, and then
and the Evangelical Reformed Church,
right,
that merger,
right.
And I have no idea who Evangelical Reformed. I don't know the history there.
Yeah, because there's some.
Is that also kind of that's kind of cousin to Baptist, that we're very American and we do our own thing.
Right. Yeah.
We do our own thing, which talking about potential denominational mergers and that. Or denominational disintegration, that's really hard. In a place where culture is very my stuff is mine.
Right.
Let out and find your own place. That's
because especially
cultural hurdle.
Yeah, because especially I think there's so many in denominations that have a more congregational. What's the word I'm blanking?
Model, the polity.
Polity, thank you. Yes. The denomination can say whatever they want. The congregation's whatever.
Yeah, we're doing what we want.
We're doing what we want to do.
Yeah.
And certainly,
I have some firsthand experience with that recently, where the church where I worked, a Methodist church, United Methodist, merged with another congregation about a year before I started working there, and it has been so good for them. It's been the best that you could have, right, out of a merger. And I'm so thankful that they were in a place where they had a bishop who was like, well, you don't merge. We get your money and your building, so maybe you should merge. And you got 6 months, and they made it happen. Because these congregational churches that are dwindling and dwindling and dwindling
right.
don't have that kick in the pants from someone in the hierarchy making them do it. So if they have the money, if they got the endowment, they can hold on forever.
Need a kick in the pants.
All 4 of them in the basement as the roof leaks. Instead of, going and being in Christian community with other people.
Yeah.
To me, it's a shame, but it's also just human nature. If you have a bunch of volunteers running things, it's a lot of work to make a merger happen. There's a lot of work, and it's a lot of selflessness.
Mm-hmm.
It's so difficult. So if you don't have the bishop, the district supervisor, the whoever it is, the presbyter, like saying, well, you have to do this, then to make it happen is just really, really difficult.
Yep. Well, let's leave it there on that high note. On that high note, where can people connect with you and find out more about your work?
Oh, find me online. You can search for my name. I am the musician, not the artist. There's another person with my same name, similar in age to me. My website is Sarah-Bereza, Bereza.com. And I also have a free newsletter that I send sporadically, but it's full of book recommendations and music that I love.
All right. Well, this has been a great conversation. Really appreciate your time and enjoyed reading the book.
Thanks for having me. This has been wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. So I always lead folks with a word of peace. So may God's peace be with you.
Amen to that.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is produced by Resonate Media. We love to hear from our listeners with questions, comments, and ideas for future episodes. Visit our website at future-christian.com and find the Connect with Us form at the bottom of the page to get in touch with Martha or Loren. But before you go, do us a favor. Subscribe to the pod to leave a review. It really helps us get this out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.